Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Damn Parenting, your English speaking parenting podcast from Amsterdam. And we are your hosts, Maren and
Eva.
Because we have, of course, another relevant topic for us. We were how's the word?
Grateful
I don't even know what I
want
wanted.
to get someone.
Yes, grateful to be able
questions.
Exactly. And we're talking about school choices today with Isabel, who is an expert on this topic and runs a whole workshop at Monty's, which is a Montessori store on Centurbahn. And because both Eva and I have children who are going to school this year when they turn 4, and we had to go through all the research ourselves, or Eva is still in the process, we thought, let's bring Isabel to the table and ask her all the questions: when to enroll, how is the process, what to look out for, what are the tips, what are the tricks. Hopefully, we were able to start digging into these topics. But if you want to know more, of course, she runs an in-depth workshop on these topics. Let's hear what she has to say and jump straight into the interview.
With that, let us please introduce Isabel Cruz. Hi, Isabel.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. So first off, why don't we ask you to give us a bit of background about yourself?
Yeah, when I get this question, I often think that I have like these 3 main identities that I guess are relevant for our conversation today. I'm a mother, I'm a parent, I'm a teacher, and also a consultant. So as a parent, I'm the mother of a 10-year-old child who has been attending a Dutch school since she was 4. We moved here about 7 years ago from the US. As a teacher, I started my teaching career in New York City, where I was a teacher for 13 years. And I always worked in public schools in the city in very different types of schools, very diverse, actually some segregated, very well-resourced, some hardly any resources. Then I moved to the Netherlands, as I said, 7 years ago. When I moved here, I immediately lucky enough to get a job at an international school here as a pre-K teacher, which would be working with 4 and 5-year-olds. And I taught there for about 4 years, and then the pandemic happened, and like many people, I started to reevaluate everything in my life. I decided to resign because I felt like, do I even want to be a teacher anymore? And I decided to take some time off. And in that time, I got really passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And so I shifted, and now I work part-time as a consultant, working with schools and school leaders, and also with people who are studying to be teachers, all around doing trainings connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with that work, I've also started doing parent workshops around these issues and topics. Through those workshops, actually, the topic of schools always comes up in some form where parents are trying to figure out how to choose the right school for their child based on different priorities or values, or just to navigate the system in itself in the Netherlands, because a lot of the people who come to my workshops are coming from other countries. And so I started a year ago doing these workshops about school choice for parents whose children are not in primary school yet, and trying to figure out how does the system work? What is this lottery I keep hearing about? What are the options? Yeah, I've put together this workshop that I offer a few times a year where we go through the system and the choices involved, and also how to figure out what was the right school for your child and your family. Yeah.
And that's the reason why I have you on today. So
yes, and hearing this, I wish I've had this podcast when I was on this journey. I wish someone sat there with me and explained all this, because I did all the research by myself. And I am lucky enough that I'm coming from a somewhat similar system from Germany, but I still came across some roadblocks, and I was like, oh God, how is this gonna work? But yeah, I did it, but I can see definitely the need for these workshops, and I would have 100% gone. So yeah.
Yeah, but I think also what you're doing with this podcast is really amazing, because I really, as a teacher, I feel really strongly about parent education, and that's what you're providing here. So yeah, kudos to you. What an amazing resource for all the families that are listening. So
thank you. Yeah, we're doing our best, but sometimes we're kind of using like Dr. Naomi for our own therapy sessions, or the next person on will be kind of like, hey, can you help us answer these questions for us too? Fortunately, yeah, we should have started this podcast a couple of years ago so we could have had you on to actually help us through our school choices, because both myself and Maren have actually already handed in our paperwork, me more recently because I left mine to the last minute. So hopefully you'll be able to help some of our listeners not do what I did and be a bit more prepared. So first question is, when should families really tackle, like should we really start looking at the school registry process?
Well, typically in the Netherlands, children start school when they're 4. It's not required, but that's typically when families will send their child to primary school. It's compulsory at age 5 and up. And because children start at age 4, the process, especially in Amsterdam, starts a few years prior to that. And I think if your listeners are coming from other cities, then it's best to investigate their local school system. But for Amsterdam, you start the process when your child is around 2.5. That's when you'll receive something in the mail, an application, a registration form, and a guide to the schools and links to websites and all of that to get started. And then the actual application for primary school will be due around more or less their 3rd birthday. If you're looking at an international school, then they will have their own process and application deadlines and registration procedures. So or it's individual by school.
So actually, let's get into that then.
I remember this.
Yeah, it's terrifying, but
I remember this whole thing of sitting in this school, and when she was 2.5 years old, and I thought, how odd is it that I'm sitting in a school, or I'm at a school viewing when I have a 2.5-year-old who doesn't know where their nose is and still uses diapers. But here we are.
I don't know if this is a typical system in other countries, but yeah, in America, we did not start this early, but yeah.
It's very early. You mentioned there actually, especially about the fact different schools have different systems. So you mentioned there the international schools and the public schools. So why don't we actually discuss these different school type options? Can you break them down for us?
Sure. So the main options, in a broad sort of way, I would say you can distinguish between, for example, we can start with international schools. So there are private international schools that are typically distinguished by their high tuition and by their really nice facilities and international curriculum. And these are schools that typically serve families that are maybe here just temporarily, that want to have that consistency with their education if they're going to be here for a couple of years and then transitioning into a different international school in a different country. So they need that continuity with curriculum and things like that, or language. And then there's also international schools that are subsidized by the Dutch government, which is something I think that's unique to the Netherlands, where because there is such a large population of people coming from abroad to work here, and something that the Dutch government decided to offer because there wasn't enough space, I guess. I don't actually know the whole story behind it, but there is this population of people that are seeking international education that are looking for it to be a little bit more accessible. So the Dutch government subsidizes the cost, and I think the tuition typically is for these subsidized international schools around maybe 6,000 euros a year, more or less. And these are schools that are serving a similar population of people who maybe are here temporarily, but sometimes these families end up staying, and their, children might stay for, their whole school career if they, but maybe in the beginning they thought they'd only be here for 3 years, and then, 10 years later, they're still here. And those are schools that also follow, those international curriculum. And then, but maybe with the subsidized school, you have a little bit more exposure to the Dutch language and Dutch cultural things because they are schools that are essentially run by the Dutch government. So there's a little bit more connection with the local culture. I'd say another category of schools would be bilingual schools. And this could be like the French school or Japanese school. And also there are schools that do Dutch and English, public schools and private schools where, say 3 days are in Dutch, 2 days are in English. There's also the Europa school that is a multilingual school where children are. It's a little bit different than a bilingual school, I guess, and it's families who are attracted to that school also often speak other languages at home besides Dutch. So at the Europa school, for example, if a child is Spanish speaking at home, the instruction is in Dutch at school, but then they get exposed to an additional language that's not one of their family languages. So like I said, if it was a Spanish speaking family at home, they would get as their additional language maybe French or English. Yeah, there's a few Dutch and English bilingual schools. And then there's also Dutch public school, which would be, your neighborhood school, and I think we'll get into this later, like, all the different options you have within that Dutch public system, like Montessori or Dalton or even religious schools. Yeah, there's a lot of choices involved, a lot of options.
So since you touched on it, actually, why don't we discuss all the different types of schools? We'll just look at it in a highlight way. Can you mention then, you already mentioned the Montessori there. So what other styles are there here?
Yeah, it's quite endless. And it's also something that, coming from the US, where things like Montessori or Waldorf or religious schools, these are all in the US would be considered, would be offered as a private option where you'd pay tuition. And then the Dutch education system. These are all available to everybody for free. So as I mentioned, there's Montessori, there's Dalton, there's Jenaplan, Fry or Waldorf. There are schools that, like I said before, religious, there's Jewish schools, Islamic schools, Catholic schools, Protestant schools, or schools that call themselves ecumenical, which would be a school that wants to celebrate all religions. And when I do my workshops, sometimes people are a little, maybe because they themselves attended a religious school and maybe they have like their own, either positive or negative experiences with that. So people want to know sometimes how religious are these religious schools? Because when you're looking up schools, you can see the affiliation, like it will say, Catholic or Protestant or something. And that's something it's good to keep in mind that if a school says Catholic or Protestant or whatever, it might be more part of their past than their present. So maybe 50 years ago, these Catholic traditions were really part of the everyday school experience. And now, present day, it's more just, something that's sort of in name only and not so much in practice. Yeah, so that's something, if that's a concern, either way, it's something to inquire about when you're touring a school and ask, like, are you doing biblical studies at the school, or what does that look like for you at that school? So yeah, you can ask about that.
When we look at the academic elements of different schools, how can families actually assess that these programs are going to be able to align with the children's own needs and interests?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky question, and it really varies by family and what your child needs. So for example, first of all, the more you observe your child, the more you know about your child, the more you can figure out what might be a good fit for them. So for example, for a child that really needs a lot of structure, maybe like a Fry school or a Montessori school might not be a good fit because there is a lot of opportunity for independence and a lot of space to have, it's a little less structured. So for a child that needs more boundaries, maybe that's not the greatest fit, but that varies by child. I would say also to definitely observe the schools, go on tours and see what you noticed. Can you visualize your child at this school? Does it seem like a place where you could imagine them fitting in? And I think if you can't visualize your child at the school, then maybe that's something to pay attention to. I think as far as like academics, as we were saying in the beginning, it is so hard to know what your child's what kind of learner they're going to be, what kind of learning style they're going to have. And when they're only 2.5 and you're making these decisions. And I think sometimes we don't know until they start school. Like as an example, I have a friend who, when their child was 4, they started at a Montessori school. And, that seemed like a nice fit. They really loved the school when they went on the tour and it felt right. But then something that they didn't realize is that their child was going to really struggle with the open-endedness and the lack of, in that particular school, all the freedom that the child had. It was really overwhelming for them. And they, would spend the mornings just so overwhelmed with the choice that they would just end up eating their lunch and eating their snack and then not knowing what to do after that. And so it turned out it wasn't a good fit. And they actually ended up moving their child to a more traditional setting. And at that school, I think it maybe was a year or two later, it emerged that their child actually had ADHD. And that's why they had struggled. And not trying to say that Montessori and ADHD don't go together, because for some children, it depends on, how that looks in that child, what they struggle with. And for this child, that time management piece and that all of that was really a challenge. So, but they didn't know that before their child started school. But then once you know that, sometimes you don't know until your child's actually in school, and then things will emerge. So, and I say this also, I guess, not to scare people, but also just to pay attention to how your child's experience is going. And if they are struggling, really, inquire and get more information, advocate for your child.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm asking that question is, coming from Ireland, we had 2 choices. You went to Catholic school or the other one. And even in Catholic schools, it's like you're a boy or you're a girl, and that's how you were separated. And then when I came here and I've had my daughter and now I'm looking at all the schools, I was like, oh, wow, like, what do they all do? And something we spoke about before we were recording here, when I was looking into the schools, like Maren says, we're spending hours, like days, reading and clicking the next thing and Google translating, what is this page telling me? We're going through quite a lot. And one of the things that I didn't realize, and thankfully I was happy to come across it, was the Waldorf school, also Steiner or Fry school. They're very much, how do we say, like participation is required from the family. And it was a lot more than I actually would have ever thought of. So, for example, one of the pages I was reading about was they were just kind of saying, like, sometimes you're like, oh, my children loves art and we're not artists, like we're scientists or researchers or whatever. I'm going to send my child here so they can express themselves. But actually, if you're sending your child to that school and then they come home to your environment and you're not even able to support them in that. Like that's a struggle. And that was something I was very lucky to find that website to start to understand, like, oh yeah, okay. So don't make the mistake of, well, this is how my child is now. Just like you said, you're making a decision at 2.5. You're going to you might change later on because of different struggles. But it's just the fact that some schools have a bit more requirement and a bit more understanding, I think. And that for me was like a massive eye opener when I came across, and I don't even have the webpage and I couldn't recall what it was. But for me, that was the thing that really stood out to me, was there is going to be different involvements that are required. And it could be, I think it's lunchtime recess or something like that. They might ask your parents to come in. It could be something as simple as that, or running the Santa Claus breakfast morning, or equally, it could be like day trips or whatever, but it could also be a lot more than that. So that was the thing for me that I really wanted to also kind of ask you about. That's something I was not aware about at all.
Yeah, I think that's really important that you're highlighting that, because different schools will have different expectations, and different philosophies will exactly have different expectations for parental involvement. And I think the Waldorf or Frey schools are probably one of the schools that require a little bit more. And so that is something to think about as a parent. It depends also, how flexible is your schedule? Are you able to give that extra time? Or are you working, or both parents, or single parent, whatever it is, are you working full time? Is that something you will be able to, get involved with? And I'm sure schools make some, of course, accommodations, but yeah, I think the message here is, to me, is that the more research the more research you do about a certain philosophy or a certain approach, the better, because you don't want to be blindsided when your child's going there and you're like, oh my goodness, I had no idea. So I just thought it was a beautiful school. The more homework you do, the better, for sure.
Yeah, and I also think it's very important what Eva said there with, what does our family life look like? What is the environment at home? Because this is exactly why I decide not to go to a Waldorf Steiner school, although I'm sending my daughter to a Waldorf Steiner daycare right now, which I think this fits for this period of time now. But then I thought, yeah, we don't live this kind of lifestyle at home so much. So I thought, well, she's going to learn all that at school, and she wants to practice and sing the songs and do all the stuff that comes with being in the anthroposophic Waldorf Steiner world. And I said, that's not what she's going to experience at home. So I said, as much as I like looking at it, as much as I appreciate certain aspects of it, it's just too far from our family reality that I thought it might be not a good fit then going forward with the education. So we decided for another school system then. But yeah, that's a very important point. And likewise also with sending them to other specialized schools where you think, oh, this is good. That's a good school. That's prestigious. That's what I want for my child. But then it's more the wish that you want this to happen than rather what the environment provides as a fit then.
Yeah, because I think something else that you're touching on too is parental involvement. And I think that's something that can vary by school as well. Like some schools will be very welcoming and, have a lot of opportunities for parents to volunteer at whatever level they're able to. And other schools might be less likely to, or less open for that. So I think that if that's something that's important to you, being involved as a parent or not being involved, maybe that's something to look at too when you're touring schools and talking to parents about certain schools. What is the level of participation in parents? What is expected? And are parents encouraged to have a voice? How does that look? And yeah, all of that's really important.
So let's dig now into actually, how do we evaluate?
Yeah, well, there's many different ways to, approach it. And I think it's the more information, of course, the better. And something that, typically parents will start with. I mean, there's the practical, thinking about location. Are you a family that, for example, for myself, I am not a morning person, and I really need to simplify my life in the mornings to make things as efficient as possible. So for me, yeah, location has always been a priority. And my daughter, yeah, she goes to a school that's a 5-minute walk from her house, and that's been really great. But for other families, maybe they have a more flexible, balance of work and family life, so they can be a little bit more open about how far their commute is in the morning. So that might be a starting point for some families. If in your family you cannot handle a long commute, then don't even consider a school that's, beyond a certain radius, because it's not going to be, if every morning's going to be stress, then that's not going to be good for anybody. Also, I think it's good to think about, well, for example, I think a lot of parents also like to know the school results. So that's sort of a common way to learn more about a school, thinking about, you can go to these different websites. I think we have a link that we can share with the parents about looking at. So there's these CITO tests that are the Dutch standardized tests, the national tests that every student takes every year. And these tests are, I guess, a way to measure the performance of the students. And for better or for worse, they can, yeah, that's a different conversation. But so you can be looking at test results. You can also be looking at some parents will look at what types of secondary schools children go to, what are the outcomes of that school. And yeah, I guess we didn't talk about this, but maybe I can do a very, very quick overview of the school system. So children in Dutch schools typically are in primary school from age 4 to 12, more or less, generally speaking. And then there's secondary school. So like, for example, in the US, we have a middle school system where when you're about 12, you have 2 or 3 years in middle school, which is a separate school on its own. And then you go to high school or secondary school. But here it's at 12. Maybe that's similar to the German system, I think. Yeah, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you go to different tracks. So in the Dutch system, you have the VMBO, which is one track where children would be like what we would say in the US, like a vocational track where you're being trained with certain skills or certain trades to, once you graduate, you'll have a job. Maybe it's working in transportation or working with animals or, being a chef. I don't know, things like that give you a skill that you can right away start working. And then there's also the HAVO track, which is also career oriented, where this would be a track where maybe if you want to be a teacher or a nurse, or I think accountant, things like that maybe require a few more years of education beyond secondary school. And then you also have the VVO, which is the university track for students who want to, go deeper into research. Maybe they're, scientists, or they want to study languages, or they want to be a doctor, something that requires a lot more, university and research. So some parents will look at the outcomes of looking at a primary school, what percentage goes to VMBO, what percentage goes to HAVO, what percentage goes to VVO. That can be a guide and I would say just as a way to look at it, for me, if a school has a really high percentage or all of this, like I've heard a friend of mine in Rotterdam was saying, when she was researching schools in her neighborhood for her child, she noticed that all the primary schools in her neighborhood, nobody was going to VVO. And it was a really, like a red flag. What's going on in these schools that nobody is going there? Because of course, in every classroom, as a teacher for 20 years, I know that every classroom you have children who have all different kinds of potential. So something is happening there. So I would say that if you see in the schools that it's very extreme in one direction or another, that for me is something to question. Even on the other extreme, where if it's a huge percentage of kids going to VVO, for me, that's also a little bit of a concern, because then what is happening at this school? Because I say this only to question, because I know that at some schools, especially in Amsterdam, where it's becoming a little bit more competitive, that there are schools where a lot of the parents are paying for private tutoring, and that's why the test scores, or that's why the results are the way they are. And it's creating sort of like this inequitable model, or not model, but inequitable system, like even more so than it already has been. And there's also some schools I've heard, and I know that there are schools that, because they have these high test scores, and for them, that's, I guess, the goal. But because of that, they will counsel out students who are not performing well and say, well, actually, your child, we can't really help them here. They need to be at a different school. That happens as well. So I would be a little bit suspicious in either extreme. I'm just saying this as a thing to look out for. But I think, because in every school, there should be representation of all different levels, right? Because children are also different. They learn so differently, and they have different interests and different strengths. And so I think for me, I just look for a balance, but people might have different opinions on that, of course.
So we've discussed about location, we've discussed about numbers. What else should families consider?
I think it's, of course, knowing your child. And I think we talked about this a little bit before, but the more you know about your child and their personality, their strengths, their interests, all of that, it's really good to pay attention to that. And, if you know your child, for example, really needs to move a lot, so maybe a program that it's not so restrictive. Not to say, I think the Dutch schools are pretty open about that. And what else? I would say also it's really helpful to talk to parents whose children go to the school, but also with the knowledge that, every parent will say different things based on their child's experience. And you could have a parent who has 2 children at that school, and one child has a really great experience, one has a negative experience. But I think it's all just about getting that firsthand information and trying to, and also I think actually one thing I tell parents when they're talking to parents, to get those stories from people who have their children at the school, to ask them, how does your school handle problems, because that really tells you a lot about a school. So for example, if a child is being bullied and, the parent goes to the teacher or to the director and says, this is happening to my child, I need your help, or how are you going to support my child? And, one school, they might say, oh my gosh, we really have to address this. We're going to do this, this, and this. And wow, I'm so sorry. Let's solve this problem. And another school might say, well, that's just kids being kids, and, good luck. So when you talk to parents, ask them, when you've had a problem at the school, how did the school solve it? Do you like the way they solved it? Because you want to be at a school where because there will be problems. So you want to be at a school where those problems are going to be handled in a way that feels, good for you and for your child.
Our kids in daycare at the moment, like, they're being bitten and there's hitting and there's sand being thrown around the place. But the thing is, in my daycare, for example, they're very much like, these are children, but we've got our eye on them and we talk to them and, we try and kind of get this communication. But obviously, as like 2-3-year-olds, you're not going to get an answer or any reason out of these children. So it's a case of, we'll keep an eye on them, but things happen as well. So
good to communicate. Yeah. So at least they know that this is something that you're concerned about.
So we're talking about talking to parents. Is there anything else? I think you were mentioning, like, so we're talking to parents, we're asking them their experiences. How else do you think we'll be able to kind of get a feel for it ourselves otherwise?
Yeah, I mean, definitely school tours are important if you are able to go on tours. I always strongly encourage people to visit schools, because sometimes we have these impressions of schools just based on what we've heard or what we've seen on the website. And then you go into the school and you're like, oh, that's not what I expected, or, oh, actually better than I thought. So I think I really encourage, and what I say in the workshops is, if you can visit at least 3 schools, I think that's great, because it's nice to have comparison. Because sometimes we have a school that when we see it, we suddenly are challenged with what we had already thought. So I definitely think having comparison is important when looking at schools, just to have that point of reference.
And then I guess finally is the admission processes. Can you actually give us an overview of that, how it works?
Yeah, well, I can speak to the system in Amsterdam where, as we mentioned earlier, you get an application in the mail when your child's around 2.5. And then when your child's around 3, you have to submit the registration form. And something important to know is, so on your registration form, you'll have the option to list as many as 10 schools. The advice I always give is to, do at least 5, but 10 gives you more security, I guess, if you don't want any chance of the city deciding on your schools, if the ones that you've chosen are already oversubscribed, and you put them in order of preference. And it's good to know that in Amsterdam, we can apply to any school in the city, but you have priority only at the ones in your zone. And when they're deciding, the algorithm for choosing who gets into what school, first they give priority to siblings who are already at the school, and then they give priority to staff children, so like a teacher or a school leader, and then they give priority to people who live in that zone or catchment area. So that's also something to think about when you're trying to strategize what school. Like, maybe there's a school that you really love that's in a totally different neighborhood, but you're not in the zone. So is that a school that's already super popular, and even people who live in that zone don't get in? Then it's not really worth even putting it on your list, because you probably have, if it's already oversubscribed, you're not going to, unfortunately, have a chance. But so I guess there's some strategy to thinking about how to list your schools. And it's also good to know that whatever deadline your application says, like if it says it's June 8th or whatever, don't miss it, because you only get one chance to enter the lottery. So if you miss it, then that's it. You're never going to get another chance. So the deadline, and maybe, I don't know how you feel about it, but so I know that you have the choice of either submitting your application online or in person. And for every family, I guess, some might feel more secure than the others. So what did you guys do? Did you do your application in person or online?
I went to the school and I handed it in, because I also took that as a second opportunity. I went there to visit the school at this informatiemorgen, like this information morning thing. And I had a very positive experience. And I thought, great, this is the one. Then I think it was like 6 months later or something. And then I thought, all right, let's go and see if I still feel like this is a good fit by just walking in and feeling it. And that's why I went there and handed it in.
Yeah, I also dropped it in, mainly because we were walking back from daycare and it's on the route back anyway. And honestly, I think online stuff, especially if it's in Dutch, it just freaks me out. And it's like, no, I just rather make sure I've got this done correctly.
Yeah, there's something about physically handing something to somebody. And I don't know if I made this clear, but you submit the application to the school. That's your number one school, whatever school you've put on the top. So yeah, so you could submit it to the school or online.
Before we'd actually walked home, we'd had the letter of like, oh, we've registered you, and we thought, oh, we've been accepted to the school. And it was only upon reading it the second or third time, and we were reading down, it's like, you'll hear from us within 2 weeks. We were like, oh, okay, right. Well, we'll wait.
So are you at this moment still in the waiting
Yeah,
space,
I'm finding out tomorrow.
Oh wow, exciting.
Yeah, we have our intake on the 11th. We got the acceptance letter a couple months ago, and yeah, now we have the intake, which is also the first step,
Nice.
in this whole school journey.
Yeah, very exciting.
That's
Oh.
actually a question I do actually have for you. Is I've heard rumors, again, I don't know where this is, but I've heard rumors that some schools will allow you, like if your child is born in, say, September, October, November, December, whatever, they can actually provide you a couple of days that you can come prior with your child so they can kind of come in and get like a feel for it prior to actually starting school, as it were.
I feel like that's something it varies by school. So that would be something to ask that individual school, because I don't think there's like a uniform policy. So some schools might offer that as a courtesy, and some schools might say, wait till September. So, but that's also a good point that if your child has a birthday, because I don't know if we said this before, that another thing that's sort of unique, at least to me, it's unique that children start school right after their fourth birthday. So for example, if your child's, birthday's February 2nd, they're going to start February 3rd. So there's children always starting throughout the whole school year just based on their fourth birthday. But if your child's birthday is like in June or July, often it's recommended that they wait until the following autumn to start, because it's by that time at the end of the year, it's not really a nice time to be a new student in a class full of kids that have already bonded and as a little 4-year-old.
Yeah, that's the case with us, that my daughter's birthday is mid-July. And then this year, the summer vacancy starts 2 days after her birthday. So she goes then in September. And one thing to note with this, if you have a case like I have, ask your daycare well in advance if you would like to have some extra weeks of daycare, because they also plan like, okay, fourth birthday, then this kid is out, next one. They might not always think about, oh, when is actually in summer vacancy, when is all that. So that's what I did. I noticed, okay, she's going to go then in September, but I do not want to be without daycare for 2 months. So I emailed the daycare in advance and said, hey, she's turning 4. Can she come a couple of weeks more until she goes to school? And they said, yes, we can do that. But that is something that parents should take in account if they have a situation like that, to well in advance, as soon as basically get in contact with the daycare to make sure you get an answer. And if it's positive, great. And if not, then you have enough time to plan.
That's really good information. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Isabel. I think you've given us quite a lot. Can you tell us a little bit more about your workshops?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So yeah, I do these school choice workshops. I do them in person, online, a few times a year. So at this point, I'm not doing another one until September for people who are trying to understand the system and start that application process for primary school. But I do have a workshop that I'm experimenting with that's going to be in May, near the end of May, because a friend of mine had this I thought it was a really great idea to have workshops for families that have their children in primary school and families who are not familiar with the system and trying to navigate, okay, my child's in school, now what? How do you troubleshoot? How do you advocate for your child? Maybe there's some things that are unexpected, sort of preparing children or preparing parents for all of those things that might be unfamiliar. So I'm doing this pilot workshop, and yeah, I can give you information to share with people if they're interested in signing up. And the first workshop will just be something where I learn a little bit about what people want support with, and then, and offer some insights.
Well, thank you again. As we were saying, or as you mentioned, we actually are going to put quite a lot of links in our show notes because it's needed. Any parents out there, there's going to be a lot of websites between the Commenta websites, the school choosing websites, parental websites. I mean, there's a lot out there. So if your child has just been born, congratulations. Start reading now. It's get yourself into the flow of things. There's a lot to read, but equally give yourself time and space, and don't be leaving it to the last minute like I unfortunately did. Isabel, thank you again. We will be adding you in the show notes, and you will be able to find Isabel on. Actually, share your Instagram account with us.
Sure. I'm at Consulting Kaleidoscope.
very active on it, I have to say, with a lot of different stories, her own personal stories, and she shares all her workshop that's actually happening as and when they happen. Unfortunately, as she said, there won't be any more school ones until September. But if you're listening in August or September, you never know. Just keep an eye on the Instagram. With that,
Yeah,
we will
great.
say thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much
Thank
for having me.
you
This was fun. Thank you.
Well,
again. We're so happy we're doing this podcast because we get to talk to the experts, we get to ask all the questions, and I'm so happy that she reassured me of the things that I was already positive on, and also that she addressed some things for parents to take notice on, especially she said the whole inclusion issue. So I was super happy with it. And one thing that I really liked, and we talked about this when we had our pre-interview with her, like a little chat, that it's very it's a big shift for internationals, especially coming from the UK and in the US, where private is like the state of the art. Everyone goes to private school.
they
If
can afford it.
any yeah, if possible, that's the way to go. And here it's the opposite. Like she said, at 1% or
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah.
Actually, I don't
So
think she said that in the episode, but she did say that to us before we were recording
yeah.
that 1% in the Netherlands actually goes to a private school.
Yeah, so I thought this was really good that we addressed this, and hopefully this will keep or this will give the parents who are coming from countries where private is the way to go, that they're not shocked here. Oh my God, what? Well, public school only? How is my child ever going to learn anything? How is the quality of stuff? And then they're surprised that there's only a handful private schools here. So because everything is subsidized and public, and you still get the same quality of the curriculum. And I thought
Yeah.
this was really good that we could address this, and hopefully this will ease some minds and take a little bit of anxiety and worry from this topic when you think, oh, public, we don't we don't want to do this because we don't it's not something that we do in our countries.
I think this is a really good topic that I wish we had started the podcast a long time ago. I would have known all this because when she said like you start thinking about it maybe at like 2.5, I thought that was kind
Mm,
of like, yeah, that's true because
mm-hmm.
you're already living in your home probably, so you're already knowing your local area, and then this is a good time to not put too much pressure on yourself, leaving it until you get that dreaded letter around the third birthday, and then to leave everything in a panic. So that was actually really good. And then it's also a case of, for example, I actually got a text message the other day from one of the parents in my child's daycare, literally saying, "What schools are you sending your daughter to?" Because it's that thing that if we're in the same area, obviously we've got the same school choices. So obviously it'll be nice to kind of send them to the same school. So there's more of an ease and relax of starting your first day, which, 4 years in a day, it's so bizarre. If you're born September, October, or April and May, I mean, it's such a bizarre starting point. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. And I felt like, there was so much more to talk about. And there's so much, it's such a different system. And that's
Yeah,
it. And the thing is, I think for people to make a good choice, and the fact that she was also reassuring us that it's a case of, yeah, you don't know your child's personality when they're 3, when you're actually
yeah,
making this choice. So you
yeah,
might move them later on, where it is more challenge or more open or more in a different
yeah,
kind of aspect. So I thought that was a great, yeah, just a great
yeah.
note to take because that's one of my big fears is having to move my child in the middle of school because of the fear of moving them to a newer, yeah, different structure.
And also how she said that nothing is set in stone. Like when she said when they move then into the higher groups that you can start in one track, you can move up into the other tracks, and it's always like, okay, what does the child need now? It's always a fresh approach, and it's not locked in. Good
Yeah.
luck, see you on the other side, kind of. But
Yeah.
really, what can we tweak? What can we challenge? What do we need to adjust? And yeah, like you said, I really liked the whole mindset of who is my child now, what fits now, and everything else can be reevaluated in a year, 2, 3, whatever. So I thought this was also taking a little pressure off. We have to find the perfect choice right now, and if not, we're doomed, and the education is down the drain. No, it's for today and for tomorrow. Next year we'll can reassess.
Yeah. And actually, one thing I did want to add there was when we were talking about the school choices, my daycare, one of the carer ladies, so wonderful, love her dearly. She's obviously very focused on Montessori as a great option, but she did say, like, when you go to the school open days or when you're talking, she says, ask them how do they support the advanced and the children who need a bit more support in another way. Ask them that question. And I was thinking, like like, you know, you've got a 2-year-old, 2.5-year-old, and you're kind of like, well, you don't know if they're going to be advanced or if they're going to be delayed with any development. And she's like, so ask them so that you know.
Yeah.
And that was the thing that when Isabel brought that up, that some schools are actually very supportive and other schools just don't have that. I think that's a really good thing to note, even for a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old.
And also with the different approaches, it's all like she said, go and see the school. How do they live a certain approach? Because there is a huge variety in Montessori. Montessori can be done in a very different way in one school than it is done in another school. Same for Waldorf, same for Freischool. All these, it's down to the school. What do they pick from this philosophy? How deep do they go into the different aspects of the philosophy? It's not you have the label and that's what you get, but it's always how much do they focus on all the different depth and turns of the philosophy. So that's also a good thing to take note of. And also, from my personal experience, don't overcomplicate things. When you have a good click and you feel this is comfortable. And like I had the feeling of, can I please enroll here? Can I please go to school here? So that was my feeling. And sometimes you just go with the feel. Like I feel this is a safe space and we'll start here. And if it doesn't work, we'll reassess.
Just for any listeners, just so you're aware, in Spotify, in the show notes, wherever you're going to read this, I am actually going to be including some links that I have found. If there's any links you guys know that I've missed, please do send them on and we'll include them as well. It's always good to know, because one of the things I was struggling with was, what does free school mean? What is that? Or, you know, what's Jenna plan? So I found a couple of websites that you'll be able to look at all the different kind of styles and what they say about them, and anything else that we've been able to grasp on our own adventures of trying to lock down our school choices. So
and you already gave me my clue word, Spotify. So I'm going to jump in. You can find us every Wednesday with an expert episode on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Every Monday, we release a Damn Chats episode where Eva and I are casually chatting about a topic that came up this week. And that's that. You can find us on Instagram, Damn Parenting Podcast. If there's anything you want to let us know, drop us a line, engage on the Spotify questions that we have, subscribe so you get a notification when we're out with a new episode. And with that, we'll hear you for a new Damn Chat next Monday and an expert episode on Wednesday. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.